have said that Carlisle and Esme were the original Bella and Edward, and the parallels between their relationships are absolutely haunting. Just on the surface, there's this repeated classic tale of an ancient vampire briefly charming a teenage girl, and she worships and idolizes him forever immediately, and he eventually makes her his undead Stepford wife. But the parallels are even more specific than I think people realize, and Edward really did follow in Daddy's creepy, self-righteous footsteps. So Esme, like all the women in Twilight, has this horribly traumatic backstory. She was born in 1895 in Ohio, and she had a pleasant childhood, but as she became a teenager, she found it hard to conform to the standards of what a lady should be at the time. So this implies that Esme maybe had something of an unbridled spirit, was maybe adventurous and even rebellious perhaps, which is very interesting considering we see absolutely none of that in the personality she has during the events of Twilight. So when Esme is 16, she breaks her leg climbing a tree, and the local doctor is away, and Carlisle tends to her, and during this brief encounter they are both deeply affected. This is the only encounter they have, by the way. Carlisle, remember, is physically 23. He was turned at 23, but he's 200 some odd years old at this point. Deeply affected for Esme, we know, means that she was absolutely enamored with Carlisle after this brief encounter. So much so that Esme didn't want to get married because no man could measure up to Carlisle. She doesn't want to get married. She wants to move out west and become a school teacher. You know who, interestingly, also wanted to be a teacher before an ancient vampire swept her off her feet? Miss Bella Swan. Interesting, but Esme's father thinks that's inappropriate for a lady and sets her up to an advantageous marriage to Charles Evanson. Turns out he is a horrible man, very abusive. Charles eventually leaves for war. She has a little bit of relief, but he comes back and she becomes pregnant. This is her motivation to escape. So she runs away, dodging Charles when he finds out about her whereabouts, and eventually ends up in Wisconsin and pursues her old dream of becoming a school teacher. But very sadly, 2 days after she gives birth, she loses her baby to lung fever. So feeling hopeless and resigned, Esme flings herself off a cliff, and Carlisle, who just happens to be in the right place at the right time, is like, not on my watch. This is 10 years after they met, and he recognized her, and he's like, oh, and takes it upon himself to turn her, which is very interesting considering Carlisle's weird motives for who he picks to turn. And when Esme wakes up after the very painful transformation, she is so happy, and I quote, to be with the man she's always idolized. And you know the rest. They quickly fall in love, and Esme worships Carlisle and just does whatever he says, and that's her life. Sounds very familiar. And what's also interesting is Bella and Esme are even described to have similar looks. They're both good girl brunettes, because we know how Stephanie feels about blondes. Good women are brunettes with brown hair and fair skin and heart-shaped faces and soft features. But what is perhaps the most odd and significant to me is this jumping off a cliff motif, because who else do we know that jumped off a cliff? But it's even more than just that. I've talked about how meaningful and powerful I think Bella's cliff diving scene in New Moon is, because I think this life versus death narrative that is set up where Edward represents death and Jacob represents life is really poetically exemplified in this scene. In Bella's case, she jumps off a cliff to hear and see Edward, figuratively and literally almost jumping to her death. And of course, Jacob finds her, pulls her out of the water, and saves her life. And I think it's so descriptively interesting, and the way it translates in the film is beautiful. But for a minute there is a narrative shift with Bella. We're following the cliff scene. She has a moment of realization where she's confronted with the reality of death and her choices, and she's like, oh, that was stupid and scary, and maybe I should stop doing this. And her relationship with Jacob is deep, and she's taking a step towards choosing to live her life. And then it's like all undone, and she snaps right back when Alice shows up and she has to go save Edward. And in light of Esme's situation, it's as if the jumping off a cliff is a means to their happy ending, because in both cases, that is ultimately what reunites them with their undead Prince Charmings. And it's so odd. And Bella's conclusion, happy ending, is hauntingly similar to Esme's, where she becomes this perfect undead rich Stepford wife with little visible remnants of her human self, just following what her husband does, what the Cullens do, dutifully and blindly. Like, Esme simply encourages and enables everything that Carlisle and Edward do, and she primarily only really cares about and prioritizes them. Esme, as we know, like the rest of the Cullens, really does not care about humans. She doesn't even like being around them. And if Carlisle, instead of being like, well, I'm a vegetarian and we creepily cosplay as humans and this is my darling son, had been like, we're just vampires and we eat people, Esme totally would have gone along with that too. When Esme first turned, she struggled a lot with the vegetarian diet and she unalived lots of people, and if it weren't for Carlisle, I don't think she would follow the vegetarian diet. She does it because he does it. He told her that's what's right. I think a lot of her prioritizing of Edward has to do with the fact that Carlisle prioritizes Edward. Esme does what Carlisle does, and the same could certainly be said of Bella and Edward. She follows her leader, and I think if Bella's circumstances were a little different and she didn't have connections to her human life, she would have entirely gone the way of Esme. Because Esme has this very robotic Stepford wife blissfulness personality, and while I've said I do not find her to be a particularly nefarious character, there is something not quite right. And you can tell upon close examination, Esme is quite creepy, and I think it has to do with what makes all the Cullens creepy. It's the artifice. She's outwardly supposed to be like blissful and motherly, but Esme doesn't care about humans. Up until Edward romanticized her and decided he was going to court her, she was just like, go ahead and eat her, sweetie, if that means you'll stay in Forks with us. And then once her darling son switches up, she's like, oh, okay, and dumps her traumatic backstory onto Bella unprovoked at the baseball game before ever speaking a word to her. And I think Esme's sadness and darkness and true nature as a vampire, because that's what she is, lurks very oddly beneath the surface, but it's very buried under this, I love this man and I'm so happy. And we definitely do see a lot of that immediately with Vampire Bella, and it's very sad and weird, but I do think over time Bella will be much more outwardly aware of regret and disillusionment and sadness as the years pass, because unlike Esme, Bella has connections to her human life. Her memories won't fade the way Esme's have. Because she got to keep Charlie, yes, but because she will always have Jacob and he will always be in close proximity to her. They will always be close because he's stuck with them forever. And I think that's probably the most meaningful human connection she could keep throughout her vampire life in terms of like awareness and disillusionment about her life for so many reasons. So I think for that reason, Esme level robotic bliss would be much harder, probably impossible for Bella to achieve over time. And I think individually their stories are both quite haunting and tragic, but in reference to each other, it's really bad. And do Bella and Esme ever bond or talk about their similarities or parallel stories? No, they don't. Bizarre.